All right, let's dive right into this explainer and completely shatter that polite Tudor illusion of a dignified passing. We're going to uncover what really happened to Anne Boleyn. For centuries, we've been handed this highly sanitized, almost romanticized version of her final moments. But when you actually look at the source material, wow, it paints a radically different and honestly a far more disturbing picture of her execution.
30 seconds. That is the haunting little interval we need to talk about right out of the gate. Because biologically speaking, when a human head is severed from its body, the brain doesn't just instantly shut off like a light switch. For nearly half a minute, neural activity actually continues. The eyes can still blink. The lips might even try to form words. Basically, there's this horrifying awareness that lingers right before fading into total darkness. And this terrifying biological reality, it very likely belonged to Anne Boleyn, the second wife of King Henry VIII. Today's agenda traces the authoritarian state's calculated campaign against her. We're looking at 1. The myth of mercy, 2. Breaking the Queen's mind, 3. The execution spectacle, 4. The campaign of erasure, and 5. The survivor's revenge.
Section 1. The myth of mercy, or Tudor propaganda versus reality.
So, to really understand this, we've got to look way past those official Tudor accounts. You know the ones. They completely glossed over the execution, selling it as a solemn, dignified passing, delivered by a swift, clean, merciful sword strike. Yeah, right. The absolute truth is that her physical death was a meticulously engineered, three-part political operation. The state wasn't just executing a person, they were systematically eliminating a massive political inconvenience. Their blueprint was brutal. Step 1, destroy her mind. Step 2, destroy her body. And Step 3, totally obliterate her historical legacy. Let's look at exactly how they pulled this off.
Which brings us to Section 2, breaking the Queen's mind through psychological warfare.
Okay, picture this. By May 19, 1536, Anne had survived 17 terrifying days locked inside the Tower of London. And talk about tragic irony, these were the exact same walls that housed her for her glorious coronation just 3 years earlier. Inside that tower, Henry's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, basically launched a masterclass in state-sponsored gaslighting and psychological torture. She was totally isolated. She was aggressively interrogated with entirely manufactured charges. I mean, horrific, totally fabricated accusations like incest and conspiracy to kill the king, all designed to completely dismantle her reputation. But honestly, the cruelest tactic of all, repeatedly postponing her execution dates. This weaponized uncertainty was purposefully designed to just gnaw away at her sanity. It was a psychological torment that was arguably way worse than the fear of death itself.
Now, you've probably heard that famous story of Anne Boleyn joking about her little neck right before her death, right? For centuries, people have romanticized that as this show of immense bravery and, dark gallows humor. But modern psychologists, they actually view it through the lens of dissociation. It's a mind's desperate defense mechanism against just unfathomable trauma. So actually, scratch that romanticized idea. This wasn't brave defiance. It was a clear symptom of total psychological despair. The state had successfully dismantled her spirit and her will to resist long before she ever even saw the executioner's blade.
Let's move on to Section 3, the execution spectacle on May 19, 1536. By the time Anne finally walked out onto Tower Green, her spirit was already completely broken. She stepped into a space packed with planted hecklers. It honestly resembled a cruel carnival more than a state execution. And get this, even the architecture of her death was weaponized. A traditional English scaffold was this towering, imposing, dignified structure that physically elevated the condemned. But for Anne Boleyn, the state deliberately built a degrading 3-foot platform. That was no accident, folks. It was a highly calculated move to strip away her royal stature, literally forcing her down close to the very mob that had been planted there just to jeer at her. So there she is on that degrading platform, and she speaks her final words. And what does she do? She actually praises the king as a merciful ruler, without ever genuinely confessing to the crimes. Now, why on earth would she do that? Well, her submissive final words were absolutely not an admission of guilt. Instead, it was an incredibly calculated, desperate sacrifice. She was trying to protect her infant daughter, Elizabeth. Anne knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that any sign of defiance on that scaffold would have triggered immediate royal retribution against her innocent child. As for the execution itself, King Henry imported a highly specialized French swordsman. And this method required a terrifyingly different, incredibly specific technique. First off, there was no wooden block to rest her head on. None. Anne was forced to kneel entirely upright. She was blindfolded, instantly plunged into darkness, and had to rely entirely on her own sheer stillness while desperately listening for the horizontal strike of an unseen blade. Can you even imagine that level of terror? The stroke itself was clean, but the horror was far from over. Remember that 30-second window we discussed at the very beginning? When the executioner held her severed head aloft to the crowd, they saw exactly that biological reality play out. Her eyes were literally still darting, her lips were still twitching, as though she was trying to finish a prayer that was interrupted by the sword. This entire gruesome spectacle was a carefully choreographed performance of absolute power. It was designed to terrorize anyone, or frankly any subject, who ever dared to rise above their assigned rank. And that brings us to Section 4, the campaign of erasure, or scrubbing the queen. With her mind broken and her physical body destroyed, the authoritarian state didn't waste a single second. They immediately pivoted to the third and final phase of their campaign, completely scrubbing Anne Boleyn from historical existence. And the sheer ruthless speed of this timeline is honestly staggering. On the very day of her execution, she was denied a proper Christian funeral. There wasn't even a coffin prepared. Her attendants were literally forced to shove her remains into an old arrow chest and bury her in an unmarked grave. And Henry? Please, he didn't pause to mourn for a second. Just 24 hours later, he became formally betrothed to Jane Seymour. This lightning-fast timeline proved beyond a doubt that this was never, ever about justice. It was just a brutal exercise in authoritarian control. Henry ordered her scrubbed from existence. Completely. His agents systematically destroyed her portraits. They painstakingly chiseled and erased her initials from the very walls of the royal palaces. Her name literally became a forbidden subject at court. But without a doubt, the most vicious part of this campaign of erasure targeted their innocent 3-year-old daughter. Little Elizabeth was brutally stripped of her title, officially declared illegitimate by the state, and basically abandoned by the court without proper clothing or care. It was a total wipeout. Finally, Section 5, the survivor's revenge and the failure of propaganda. For centuries, Henry's propaganda machine actually succeeded in recasting this horrific execution as an act of mercy. It laid the groundwork for this perfectly sanitized Tudor history we've all been taught. Yet, despite the psychological torture, despite the physical degradation, and despite the systematic destruction of her identity, Henry's meticulously planned campaign ultimately failed. Why? Because the very toddler he discarded without a second thought survived. That abandoned 3-year-old grew up to become Queen Elizabeth I. She went on to rule for nearly half a century, defining an entire era of human history. And in doing so, she permanently cemented her mother's place in the history books. Henry tried so hard to erase Anne Boleyn, but his own daughter made absolutely sure the world would never, ever forget her. So, this explainer leaves us with a chilling, but I think ultimately triumphant realization about the limits of authoritarian power. It really makes you ask, how fragile is truth under absolute power, and can the machinery of propaganda ever truly silence it? Anne Boleyn's execution serves as a timeless warning about state control, but her enduring legacy, that is proof that even the most brutal propaganda machine cannot permanently erase the truth. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other erased truths from history are just waiting out there to be uncovered?